And when it comes to building a system that may not always be handled by designers, I think that's just part of the constraints that we try to consider. Specifically with Spotify, we several of the techniques we selected them because we felt like they enabled maybe people who weren't practiced with the system to still create something that felt on brand and reasonably good.
Sort of one of the projects that your studio is famous for was obviously the Spotify rebrand. And that's an interesting project because it's so large in terms of how many items it touched and how many things it needed to consider, and the teams who you had to take along for the ride to roll it out, because you didn't necessarily design every single last piece that people see. Can you talk a little bit about that project and how you got the people inside Spotify to understand what you were trying to do and work with them to ultimately deliver that piece of work?
Yeah, Spotify was a huge project for me on a number of levels. We talked about this a little bit in the pre-call, but I think for Collins, it was one of a series of projects that I think put us on the map a little bit more. From a kind of structural sense, it was a project where we kind of honed a theory of design at scale that we've kind of continued working on since then, and has proven to be kind of like fairly successful for us. And I think the lesson that we learned is that it's a totally different problem than trying to, say, design something small or even mid-size where you have a lot of control over the output and the number of touch points are more finite. So as you say, the challenge with massive brands is you need to serve so many departments who probably don't talk to each other all that often. There's so many channels in which the brand lives. Customers' expectations these days are of brands that respond in real time or extremely quickly. And so the problem becomes not how do we design this perfect artifact in a vacuum, but how do we enable an organization to create great work consistently when the cost that's creating that work is often changing or variable as much as anything, and the channels and the places that idea will live. So I guess the difference is, or how we approach that is really boiling it down as simply as possible is it's a toolkit, which sounds really dumb, but I think Brian has the best quote for this, which is design is not what we make, design is what we make possible for others. Brian Collins, our founder. And I think that's really true of how we approach massive brands. The internal team is effectively the design, is effectively the brand. And so a lot of the project is trying to solve the external challenge. What are we trying to communicate? What's appropriate to our audience? What is the thing that the audience is going to see, and thinking about it through that lens, but also understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the internal team, how that's likely to change, who's going to be executing on a day-to-day, and then trying to build a system that plays to those people's strengths or to that organization's strengths in a way that's going to, when we disappear, is going to set them up to continue to succeed or hopefully, improve on the work that we've done. When you think about brands like Spotify, there's no way that our 5-person team that worked on that project is going to solve all of the problems of a kind of international, massive, multi-billion-dollar company. So it really becomes a partnership at that point, and it's really about understanding what they need and trying to build a toolkit that's going to best serve them.
It's like, what are some of the things that you had to create to make it work when it's no longer being designed in Illustrator by a trained designer? It's potentially being put together by a community manager or a product manager or anybody else. How do you solve for that?
So we were kind of figuring out the road as we built it. But I think the basic components that are kind of core, the best brands are familiar and surprising. Like that's the equation, or this kind of like seesaw that you live on, where you need elements that are consistent and are recognizable, and that's things like logo and typeface. Often the kind of things that you're going to see over a 5-year period, and you're like, okay, that's the brand I know and love and I trust, and it has this kind of like halo effect. But if your brand never changes, especially in the today's age, people are going to get houseblind and bored of it very quickly. So you also need components that are built to deliver surprise, that are flexible, that are better at telling. So logos and typefaces and things like that, they can tell a really high level implicit story that is hopefully always true. With Spotify, color became a big piece of that, and we use color as a way to communicate range of emotion, because it was the best visual analog to music's kind of, music is inherently emotional, and color was the best way to kind of visualize that, and it allowed us to create a sense of variety and pop culture and all those things. But then there's the second layer, which is how do we be contextually specific? How do we talk to a specific audience? How do we tell more detailed stories? And that's where you have elements that are designed to be a little more flexible and to evolve over time. So core elements are usually things like logo, typeface, color often. And then there's somewhere in the middle is usually like a layout system or a principle around how you kind of arrange elements. And then in the more dynamic, kind of surprising end of the spectrum, you have things like photography, illustration. Those are usually the most dynamic things. And that's kind of the toolkit, I suppose, is how we would think about the core pillars that make up any kind of brand at scale. It doesn't mean that they're all always true, or that you have to have all of them, or anything. When it comes to building a system that may not always be handled by designers, I think that's just part of the constraints that we try to consider. Specifically with Spotify, several of the techniques we selected them because we felt like they enabled maybe people who weren't practiced with the system to still create something that felt on brand and reasonably good. So you could still kind of show up as a lay person or as like a less practiced person and still deliver things that were great. So we gave them this little piece of software, and they could give that to people who weren't in the design team, and it allowed them to kind of shortcut essentially what is a fairly simple process on Photoshop, but just took all of the choice out of it, only left you with the kind of core brand colors and a random button, which really just cycled through all of our favorite color pairings. So just like, it's just like all of these things are small little pieces of the puzzle that you try to fold into the answer as you go. But
I mean, I like that because it seems a lot of the bigger brands that we work on and work with, quite often the way of controlling it is those brand guides are so constrained that you can't do anything. They're just like, this is the layout, this is the grid, these are the 17 images you can use, those are the colors. So you just drop in your line of copy here, drop that. Now, how do you reconcile this idea of craft and the idea of scale?
I don't think there's like a secret sauce. I think you're 100% right. Craft and scale definitely are at tension with each other. I think craft is really just consideration of every detail, and scale is often about finding efficiencies, right? And so those two notions are kind of at odds with each other, because as you scale, complexity grows exponentially, and it becomes more and more work to consider every detail. So I think there's no secret sauce. Honestly, it's just like passion and practice and probably a healthy dissatisfaction for the status quo. I think unrelenting care for the details to probably like a somewhat obsessive level. Craft at scale is the same as craft anywhere else. It's just trying to bring intentionality and consideration to every decision. What I've loved about Collins, and what has been the kind of ongoing experiment, I've been here 8 years now almost, is trying to find that middle point between those two. How do we hang on to the craft and the care and the attention to detail that is that I traditionally assign to kind of smaller studios and often art projects, and how do we find ways to bring that into projects at scale and operationalize it in this much more complex environment and help clients understand the value of it and all of that kind of stuff. We feel the tension between good business and good design constantly, like we talked about earlier. Good design is so often a factor of time,